is bring you, along with this conference and all the shows that we do, speakers, guests and opinions, not always in agreement. We never are. The truth movement especially, we're not always in agreement. What I do wish from you for the next two speakers, emotions and a few pints, etc., if we could just let these guys speak, and any questions you've got, if you could just keep them to the end, that would be fantastic. Because I'm having a heart attack over here, so we're going to watch what's going on. So, okay. Right guys, next speaker, I saw David 4 years ago, I think it was, on the Edge media show on Sky, and frightened the life out of me really, because someone who can actually stand up around like Albert and just tell it like it is, and without so-called fear really, and put us all in the picture. So from that, David was on the business show on Critical Mass Radio about a month ago, six weeks ago, and so we decided to get him here today and really give us an informal talk. Tell again, it's going to be. I'll tell you what I'm just going to do. I'm going to pass this over to David. Round of applause and enjoy this talk. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, what country do you live in? Someone give me an answer. Who?
UK PLC.
Right.
Great Britain.
Another answer?
Great Britain.
Okay, I heard one answer from over there, which was the one that our government sees it today. And this is probably the most astute audience we're going to get. Most of the people have no idea what's going on, and that's why we need critical mass. I hate the Queen. I absolutely hate the bitch. Because she has signed 6 EU treaties which abolish our nation. And, you know, she should have hung by the neck until she was dead on the first treaty. She should be dead 6 times over by now. Yeah. But I do have to say that when you mount an attack, a frontal assault is not always the best way to go. And I am absolutely stunned at the progress that Albert has made over the last couple of years. And I'm absolutely sure that his approach is the right one. And I'm just here to tell you how bad things are and why we've got to do it. So let's go back to a subject that Albert likes, which is crime. Who commits most of the crime in this country? Or to put it another way, which branch of society do we need to eradicate to stop most of the crime in this country? What's the answer?
Government, social services.
Crown corporation.
Government.
Well,
Well, that's the best so far. 95% of the crime in this country is blindingly obviously committed by government. And let's just have a look at some of them. We invaded Iraq on lies about weapons of mass destruction that the government knew perfectly well did not exist. And over 1 million people are now dead as a result. It really doesn't matter whether you call it manslaughter or murder, it's still a crime. It's a war crime, and if people aren't being hung for it, they should be in jail for life for it. The banks were deregulated by the government in 1999, deliberately turning them into casinos and creating bubbles in every market you can imagine. The housing market, the derivatives market, the stock market. And that was done to debase the economy and the currency. And it was deliberate. Why did they do it? Their goal is to impoverish and disempower us, and thus reducing our ability to resist. The abolition of Britain by the 6 EU treaties was, of course, executed by our top 17 government ministers who committed treason and have been EU Bilderbergers, bribed agents since Edward Heath. Now, it absolutely stuns me how the people of this country watch the government illegally not representing them. The only people that the government are allowed to represent and the only wishes that they are allowed under the Constitution to implement are our wishes. That's part of the Constitution. It's just stunning how many people have not noticed that this is not happening. And of course, all these EU laws, 120,000 EU regulations, 6 EU treaties, and 300 major EU laws have gone through Parliament against the wishes of the people, completely illegally, and the people still can't work out that the government is breaking the Constitution. I mean, it's as plain as the nose on your face. So why does it happen? And it happens simply because the top politicians are bribed, bought, owned and paid for by the European Union and have been since Edward Heath. They got hold of, if you like, the critical mass of the Conservative Party. The top 8 Conservative ministers were Bilderbergers back in Edward Heath's time, and 8 was enough to begin the abolition of a 3,500-year-old nation. And it took 40 years to abolish a 3,500-year-old nation. And the number of Bilderbergers is now 17. You know, they've got 8 in the Labour Party, 8 in the Conservative Party, and 1 in the Lib Dems, Nick Clegg. And who knows who the most senior Bilderberger is today? Who is the real Prime Minister today? And who does Cameron get his orders from?
Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg, British Mandelson.
I heard 2 Clarks. You're absolutely right. Ken Clark is the senior Bilderberger. The most visible Bilderberger is, of course, Angela Merkel. He possibly gets his orders from her, but it's probably from a bit further back. And the government does not represent us. The government represents the European Union. You get EU policy, whichever party you vote for. Treason is the most serious crime because out of the last 2,000 years, we've only had about 200 years of half-decent democracy. And they are now trying to put us back into the normal state for mankind, which is slavery, which of course is where it's always been, with an elite totally owning and controlling everyone else. It happened in Roman times, it's happened right through history. And stopping the return to slavery is the most important thing a constitution can do. And that is why treason is the most important crime. Unfortunately, the British Constitution wasn't given the teeth to deal with saboteurs on the inside. And that's how a small number of people right at the top were able to subvert a constitution that is nearly 1,500 years old. So let's just look at a few more crimes. On the orders of their masters in the EU, our bribed politicians have closed down our heavy industry, swamped us with 25 million immigrants, and the Office of National Statistics now state that the English will be a minority in their own nation by 2025. The English are, of course, despised by the European Union because we stopped the creation of this dictatorship in 1918, we stopped it again in 1945, and they know that it is us that have to be destroyed if this dictatorship is to succeed. So the ethnic cleansing of the English by the EU has been incredibly successful. It's an electoral and constitutional crime for the government to represent a foreign power. And in fact, it's a crime for them to represent anything or anyone except us, the electorate. And that's something they haven't done for 40 years. Our senior police, Crown Prosecution Service and judges are almost exclusively Freemasons, and Britain's courts have been utterly corrupt for 20 years now. And that is how the banks, the politicians and the government are able to commit these crimes, break our law and our written constitution, because they know they appointed the judges. And over the last 40 years, they've moved about 50,000 people up into every position of power. These are people who are corruptible, who they know are pro-EU, or who they know they can control. Britain is home to the largest bribery structure in the world. The EU mandated 8,500 quangos who waste 200 billion a year. 15 years ago, we didn't have any. That's 12% of our gross domestic product. And if David Cameron really wanted to balance our budget, and nothing is further from his mind, and the EU wouldn't let him balance the budget, because if he did, our economy would recover. But we are about 157 billion a year in the red, borrowing every year because the government isn't raising enough taxes. At a stroke, he could be in 50 billion surplus just by abolishing the 8,500 EU quangos. And these are bribery structures where people are paid between 150,000 and 700 a year to do really nothing, but it's government patronage. Once they accept that money, they are controlled. And it's either influential people who the government wants to control, or it's their mates, and they just want to put some money in their pockets. That's 12% of our gross domestic product. In total, over half of the 800 billion the government raises in taxes every year is obviously and deliberately wasted, and that is a crime as well. The NHS is controlled by common purpose. And they are the people who state, of course, that they are going to run local government departments in the post-democratic era. This is the post-democratic era. And through their social engineering and policies of continual change, according to a common, they now cause 60,000 preventable deaths in the NHS every year. And that's a common select figure, select committee figure, 60,000 preventable deaths. They're now also killing 100,000 a year on the Liverpool care pathway. That's where they decide, well, this person's a bit old, we don't pay for him anymore, so they just deny them food and water, and the patient dies of ghastly dehydration in a few short days. And of course, there are 70 farmers a year committing suicide, as a sidetrack here. 70 farmers a year are committing suicide because of the horror of the common agricultural policy. And they have spy satellites, European spy satellites, that actually spy on farmers' land. And if they do anything or change anything, they get a fine, and the fine can put them out of business. Common Purpose also teach suicide to impressionable youngsters through theatre, plays and workshops, and probably their crowning achievement there is to successfully encourage 79 youngsters in Bridgend, South Wales, to commit suicide. That is all crime. David Cameron says he'll do something about immigration and have a bonfire of the quangos. He's lying, of course. As an EU Bilderberger, he's not allowed to do any such thing. And if he ever attempted to go against EU and Bilderberger policy, he would be moved out of office very quickly by the other Bilderbergers, just like Margaret Thatcher was when she changed her mind in 1988. That's why there won't ever be an EU referendum by any party, because they are all controlled by the European Union, and the European Union obviously doesn't want one. So they talk about this stuff to get elected and to make people think, oh, we can relax now, there's going to be a referendum, the quangos are going to be abolished. But of course, it's all lies. It's never going to happen. So if you add up all the crime committed by the ordinary criminals in England, it's not even a pathetic dot. And the criminals haven't even managed to murder 100 people a year in England yet, I don't think. And yet the government's managed to murder 1 million in Iraq. Probably the biggest crime financially is the abolition of a $10 trillion nation, Britain, with the Lisbon Treaty. But the crimes of government dwarf all other crimes. And the government is guilty of fraud, tax extortion, as well as murder. As Mussolini said, fascism and communism are the government collaborating with large corporations to defraud the people. We've seen it on a massive scale with the banks, through the utility companies, which they sold abroad to foreign nations who rip us off because they really don't give a damn about us. And even the local councils are ripping us off as well. Millions of people from the former nation of Britain are now impoverished, and as a result of government crime are trying to survive on £5 an hour or less. And by paying taxes and by voting for the Lib Lab Con, you are supporting the criminal government class and helping them deprive you of everything you once had. Does anyone disagree with any of that? Nope. So,
excuse me?
Yep.
I do.
You do?
Yes.
I don't believe it.
Did anybody vote for the Lib Lab Con?
So it's also stunningly obvious, why haven't we already got the critical mass? And it may actually be coming. I mean, when I first started doing these talks 7 or 8 years ago, no one in the audience would say boo to a goose. And yet tonight we've seen some really angry people. Now, I haven't seen that before. The message is getting through, and people should be angry. Everyone should be bloody angry.
Look at English slightly method.
So, let's digress a bit into Julian Assange. Because he's the WikiLeaks founder, and he's published hundreds of thousands of government documents that convict the British-American governments of war crimes. In return, senior Bilderberger William Hague, our Foreign Secretary, is attempting to silence this prosecution witness, as a gangster would, on behalf of the Bilderberg ministers he's protecting. He's also illegally threatened the Ecuador embassy in Hans Crescent, which is only a flat, which is where Assange is living, with an attack to force Julian Assange out. If the Americans ever get their wish to extradite Assange via Sweden, they will silence him permanently, even if it's just by putting him in a prison and leaving him there. There may be a show trial, but the British and American courts are so corrupt they can get any verdict they need. So as our bribed government officials, such as the 9 Bilderberg ministers who control Westminster, commit treason by abolishing their nations in favour of the dictatorship of the New World Order, more and more injustice emerges. Our British government illegally abandoned its duty to protect its own citizens by signing extradition treaties with countries which have records on human rights far worse than our own. So instead of giving Julian Assange asylum in England, they are trying to hand him over to Julian Assange into a country, the USA, that is still, after 10 years, still torturing hundreds of innocent people in Guantanamo Bay. And of course, Obama promised he'd get rid of Guantanamo Bay. It didn't happen because Osama is, of course, a George Bush-style Republican and is controlled by them.
Obama even. Freudian slip.
Sorry?
Freudian slip. Osama, Obama.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just call them Barney.
Yeah. So, you know, all these poor Americans thought that, you know, with Obama they were going to get a proper Democrat, and they didn't. They just got another New World Order government. So why are our ministers so afraid of Julian Assange? Well, they used, in addition to killing 1 million people, they used depleted uranium ammunition prolifically, and there are now thousands of Iraqi children born horrifically deformed.
It's not depleted then, is it?
Sorry?
It's not depleted uranium then.
Yeah.
It's still radioactive.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, people rightly refer to bankers as banksters, but it was government ministers that deregulated them. Clearly our government ministers are now gangsters, but the sheer scale of their fraud makes people like Al Capone look like innocent children with rattles. David Kelly, Dr. David Kelly, John Smith, former leader of the Labour Party, and Robin Cook MP, former Foreign Secretary, have already been murdered because they would not comply with the corruption. And I would suggest that Julian Assange needs all the help we can give it. Of course, the European Union is part of the New World Order. It's just our end of it. So a quick history of, recent history of the New World Order is perhaps worth a look at. It was Prescott Bush who financed Hitler into power between 1922 and 36, and of course he is the grandfather of the last Bush president. And he was tried and convicted on the 20th of October 1942 of financing Hitler into power under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And his bank, the Union Banking Corporation, with which he financed Hitler into power, was taken from him. And yet still the Americans vote for them. We want critical mass over here. How are they ever going to get it over there when Americans are as stupid as that? The Vietnam War was started by the OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA. they destabilized the government of Vietnam, got a few American troops in, and eventually got the whole army in, and they killed 6 million Vietnamese and made an absolute fortune for the arms manufacturers who control the OSS. Then, just before I go any further, I need to ask a general knowledge question. Who killed the last non-New World Order president of the USA, which was, of course, John Kennedy? Who was the man who organised his murder? And I'll give you a clue. It was the same man who organised 9/11. So he's obviously a pretty old man now. Isn't it stunning how many people know that it was indeed Bush Senior? I even talk to Americans, and you know, I speak to Americans quite a lot, which is quite a difficult thing to do because they don't seem to understand anything I say. But even they tell me it's George Bush. They all bloody know it. It's amazing. So, I don't know, I really do actually think there's a possibility that people are waking up.
It's stupid because I actually didn't know it was George Bush Senior until now.
You only just found out now?
Honestly, straight up.
Yeah, but didn't you know in your subconscious? You weren't surprised, were you?
Well, I said Kissinger, but you know.
Yeah, but you weren't
No, I wasn't
surprised, were you?
but it's a
Nothing surprising about him.
I lived in America for 8 years, and while I was out there, I did a bit of political research, and it was pretty damn obvious that Prescott Bush had killed, George Bush had killed Kennedy. So I put up a website to publish it, and then the Democrats in Hollywood made a blooming film on it, which I don't think got very wide coverage in the USA, but it was shown on I think it was either ITV2 or BBC 2 or 4 or something, but it made it to British television, and they had it all right, you know, they had it tracked right the way through.
What's the name of that film?
I can't remember, it was about 4 years ago. Sorry?
That's based on Jim Mars's book, the Oliver Stone film.
So then George Bush's career moved up a step from being southeastern commander of the CIA, which is why he murdered Kennedy in Dallas, to being sent out to being director of the CIA in 1980. He was top director of the CIA, and he was sent out to Afghanistan with $3 billion of taxpayers' money to arm the Mujahideen. And he had a very simple deal going with the various chieftains. Say, right, well, you can have some of the money, but you've got to spend it in my weapons corporation. And what's George Bush's weapons corporation called? No, that's Dick Cheney's. Sorry? That's it, it's the Carlyle Group. And who is European Managing Director of the Carlyle Group with a job for a life on $1 million a year? John Major, absolutely right. Do you know why he got the job? Because he sold Devonport Dockyard to Dick Cheney's Halliburton Group, and 3 weeks before he left office, and his bribe was $1 million a year for life as European Managing Director of the Bush family's Carlyle Group, a triangular deal. So, after George Bush armed Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in 1980 in Afghanistan, 2 million people died. So we're up to 8 million now. That's 6 million in Vietnam. That was the OSS and the CIA. Now we've got another 2 million by the CIA. And, and then the next trick, of course, was the Iran-Iraq War, where George Bush Sr. persuaded his mate Saddam Hussein, who had been supplying with arms for many years, to invade Iran. 1 million Arabs died. And George Bush was supplying both sides. And you may remember Oliver North standing up before a congressional hearing, lying to protect the president. Anyone remember those words, lying to protect the president? He wasn't. He was lying. The president, of course, was Reagan, who had no bloody idea what was going on. He was lying to protect the vice president, which was George Bush. And with some of the money they made out of that, they armed the Contras in Nicaragua and killed another 100,000 there. And then, of course, we had Iraq Wars 1 and 2, where they killed 250,000 in the first one and 1 million in the second one. So, what are we up to now? 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, 7 million. That's 8.25 million dead. And that's the USA, particularly the CIA. Now, apart from making a lot of money, why do they want to do this? Well, they do have a pretty satanic desire to kill as many people as they want to, because they want to depopulate the world down to the level that they deem acceptable. But it does another thing for them. It gets Arabs mad. And it actually gives Arabs the moral right to kill us, because we have killed so many of them. And they are horrifically disappointed how little Arab terrorism there has been in response. But even with the little bit of terrorism there has been, and it is tiny, and they did create all of it, they are bringing in laws which abolish our freedom using terrorism. The terrorism that they created as an excuse. And, of course, it's not just the CIA. Complicit in all of this is MI6, who've been running drugs just like the Bush family were doing, into Arkansas and through the oil rigs that Halliburton owns. But MI6, and to a lesser extent MI5, have been deeply complicit in this. And it was a bit of an eye-opener for me to watch Skyfall. How many people have seen Skyfall? Do you know what the message of Skyfall is? It is that MI6 is more involved with corruption and duplicity and double-crossing and dishonesty than it ever is at doing any good at all, and it does none, for us. And here we have the film industry educating us subliminally again. A lot of people are now thinking, you know, what the hell is MI6 doing? And last night I foolishly watched the film till rather late. And what was it about? It was about a gun-toting special boat squad man who found that the American government and the CIA were killing off people in towns to lay a pipeline. And, you know, lots of explosions, and he brought lots of people, killed a lot of people, and then dragged the senator involved in front of the proper authorities to have him dealt with. And, of course, the government wouldn't deal with him, wouldn't prosecute him, wouldn't do anything. So he went around his house and shot him all and all his friends and blew his house up, and that was the end of the film. But that's a subliminal message to Americans that their government is as bent as a hairpin. And Hollywood is doing a lot of this. And I think the message is beginning to get through. And the anger that I saw here is another example. Now, the European Union in its desire to abolish the nation of Britain, has 200 Frankfurt School subversion techniques that work against us. And political correctness is one of them. We dare not speak out anymore, because if we speak out, we're wrong. The ethnic cleansing of the English is another. The overtaxation into poverty is another. The corruption of the courts, the dependency upon social security caused by poverty that they have bred is another. But the ethnic cleansing of the English has been stunningly successful. And of course, if you rob a nation of its identity, we won't bother to fight anymore, because, you know, basically it won't be our country anymore. And that is their aim. And it's EU policy, of course. So you look at cities like Leicester, Bradford, Birmingham and Oldham, down to 10% English. Blackburn, Bolton, Burnley, Luton and London are only about 40%. And it's estimated there are about 25 million legal immigrants in the country. And actually the only people who actually know this are the supermarkets, because they can tell it by their sales. The British government, of course, hasn't told us. But the government very cleverly directs all our anger at the 675,000 illegal immigrants, who are in such small numbers it really doesn't matter. So since Edward Heath signed that treaty, and he's an interesting man, he went to Oxford, and there he knew Geoffrey Rippon and Roy Jenkins. And they took a little jaunt off to Germany in 1958 to be recruited by the Deutsche Verteidigungsdienst Intelligence Department. And, sorry?
It's easy for you to say.
Why is it easy for me to say? You know, you ask, why do they do that? Well, you look at Philby, Blunt, Burgess, Maclean, and there are people who are traitors, who love being traitors. And they are not like us. If you look at their sexual habits, they tend to be paedophiles or whatever, but they're not the same as us. They are very different people. Ted Heath himself, of course, was a homosexual. And he became a Bilderberger in the late 60s. So he was not only a double agent, which possibly makes the Treaty of Accession invalid, because the person who signed it on behalf of the Queen was his Bilderberg mate. So that is possibly an invalid treaty, because both the signatories on it were double agents. And of course, with Edward Heath came the first obvious EU bribe with associated money laundering. Pretty much as soon as he signed the 1972 Treaty of Accession, he suddenly came into a huge amount of money, bought a £3.5 million house near Salisbury, bought a yacht called Morning Cloud, and spent £1 million racing it. Which is pretty good going for a man with a £6,000 house bungalow in Broadstairs on a £3,000 mortgage and a salary of £21,000 a year as Prime Minister. And of course that was money laundered to him as a Nobel Peace Prize. And Marta Andreasen, the budget director of the European Union, reported that the EU was unable to account for 95%. That's not 5%, that's 95% of its expenditure. And part of the reason for that is so much of it go on bribes. But if you're a Prime Minister and you sign an EU treaty, you get a £10 million bribe, and Ted Heath was the only one that had it money laundered to him while he was still in office. All the others have got theirs later. So Tony Blair signed 2 EU treaties. So he was due 20 million. And while he was in office, he bought his house in Eaton Square, which was the best part of 4 million quid, and 3 other houses. And the press were writing at the time he couldn't possibly afford to pay the mortgages on those houses. Well, of course, he knew he was never going to have to pay them. And when he left office, he suddenly became phenomenally wealthy. He got a £4 million a year non-job as Middle East peace envoy. Well, he's never been to the Middle East. He's hated out there. He couldn't possibly be a peace envoy. And he also gets a £2 million a year job in banking as a non-executive director of I forget which bank. But not surprisingly, the chairman of the bank was another Bilderberger. So this is how the money is money laundered. It comes from the European Union to the bank, and then the bank pay it out as a so-called salary to Tony Blair. So he's pretty much had his 20 million now through money laundering. And the bit that pisses me off is the government that's passed all the money laundering regulations are the people who are actually doing the money laundering, but the regulations only apply to us, ordinary people, who aren't doing any money laundering. That really hacks me off. I mean, I gave my mother 3,000 quid because she was a bit hard up, and we both got done for money laundering. Well, you may have noticed that we, the English, are at the bottom of every government queue, be it for housing or any kind of benefits. You see people getting, brand new Audis, but they're never English. And, we can't even get a fair trial in our courts. And of course, as Albert Burgess told you, they break our constitution at every opportunity. The Act of Settlement 1701 states that no person born outside Britain may be a member of either House of Parliament or enjoy any office or place of trust, either civil or military. Now that's the law. Just look how much that's being broken. And it's rather similar to the law in America. You can't be president of America unless you were born in America. It doesn't. Sorry?
Unless your name's Barry.
The Daily Mail reports that a Somalian was given the keys to a £2 million house in West Hampstead, costing them £8,000 a month, and that's the second of the houses that we're paying for that one man. He's never worked in the 3 years that he's been in England. Now, there are plenty of people in this room who would love a £2 million house paid for by the government. And do you think any of you are ever going to get it? Why do they give it to foreigners? Because we are not wanted here. They don't want the English in England. They hate us. And they're trying to make it as clear as possible that it's time to leave, and we are leaving at the rate of 380,000 a year. But that's not fast enough for them. So, foreign drug dealers, rapists and murderers cannot be deported from, where? England. So, at least the newspapers report that this are happening, and they're astonished. They're not really astonished, they do really know what's going on, but they will not report why. And of course the Race Relations Commission was set up to make sure that we, the British, do not complain at being overrun. Only the English can be guilty of discrimination. And actually, we're the most tolerant nation on earth. We are the most tolerant people you could possibly find. We really are friendly, nice with everyone of every nation. But it was rather surprising when Trevor Phillips, who is of African descent and head of the Race Relations Commission and the Equality, I think it was the Equality and Human Rights Commission when he actually said this. And he did mention in a speech that under Article 8 of the Human Rights Convention, every indigenous people is entitled to their own land, and this is being denied to the English. And then he was told to shut up in no uncertain terms, and he never mentioned it again. So Albert has given us a really good legal route to get out of the EU. And I think if we do a frontal attack, I'm sure it'll fail, as Albert says. You know, I mean, what would be my preferred legal route? I'd like to take the Queen and all 17 Bilderberg ministers in power at the moment, put them in a court, try them for treason, and hang them. All 18 of them. That's the obvious way to do it. But unfortunately, we don't have a critical mass yet. And the people of England, though they like her because she waves, really pisses me off! So, Albert's approach has been absolutely stunningly successful so far. And I think it's the best way to get at them from behind and get them bitten in the arse before they actually realise what's happening. So I really do think that Albert's route is the best one, and I do recommend that you join his team of 100 who are working on it. The more we get on the team, the more action there'll be, and the more potential prosecutions there will be. So that's the legal route. Now what's the economic route? How should we leave the EU? Well, a lot of people talk that we can't survive on our own, blah, 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 which I find a bit odd because, well, that is of course the Frankfurt School subversion technique, to tell you your nation is crap, when actually we are the 6th largest economy, no, it's not, probably not right now, it's probably about the 8th largest economy out of 205 nations. So how are the other 97 going to survive that are smaller than us? You know, absolutely ridiculous, but so many people believe that, it's quite incredible. But Iceland went into financial meltdown 4 years ago, and it allowed its corrupt banks to go bust, which is what should have happened here, and started again. And okay, they had a pretty desperate year for 1 year, but 3 years later, they are now stronger than pretty well every European economy. In fact, the only other economy that's stronger than them is actually Turkey. They had 11% growth last year, while Greece was 7% negative. And the Greeks are absolutely hopping mad because they've always thought they're better than the Turkish, and the Turks are pissing all over them. And Turkey is rolling with money. They've got Turkish-built mega yachts, 120 foot long, a couple of million quid and more each, finished to British standards that they built in their own shipyards. They are rolling in money, and the Greeks are starving. And what's the difference between the two countries? There is only one difference. One country's got Turkish lira, the other country's got the euro. I digress a bit, but I was in, where was it? What was the island called? Naxos? Yes, I was in the island of Naxos on their one-day strike about the euro. That wasn't very well reported over here, was it? Greece had a one-day strike against the euro. Who knew that? 3 people. It wasn't reported over here. And they had all these loudspeakers in the square, and microphones and things, and of course, I just couldn't resist. So I walked on, do you mind if I say a few words? So I told them, you know, what you need to do is the Greeks hate their own politicians. The reason the Greeks are in Europe is because their own politicians are so corrupt. They think the European politicians will be less corrupt and emasculate their own politicians. That's the reason the Greeks are in the euro. But anyway, I said to them, you know, all you need to do is to follow the example of Iceland, go back to the drachma, and you'll be the strongest economy just outside Europe 3 years later. And I got a bigger cheer than all the rest of them. So, if we wanted to leave the EU and be the strongest economy in the world, very simply, we'd back the pound either with a basket of 30 commodities, or gold or silver, would allow the corrupt banks to go into liquidation, and would move the assets and the accounts of the corrupt bank across to a British bank or national bank, and we would keep the officers, junior staff of those banks, but we would fire all the senior staff on the grounds that they had abjectly failed. And you would also pass a law to say that no redundancy is payable and no compensation, so they go straight to the dole, which is where they should have been. And by the way, we don't have any debts to the EU, but Greece does. And Greece should not repay its debts to the EU because that money was a Trojan horse to drive them into poverty. What the European Union did is it shut down Greek manufacturing because, you know, the hot countries can't work half the day. They basically work sort of 8 till 12 and then they work 4 till 9. And they were perfectly all right while they had their own manufacturing industries, but they couldn't compete with Germany and Northern Europe, so they had to close all their manufacturing industry when they went into the EU. They still need all the consumables, so they had to buy them from Northern Europe at the rate of 100 million a year, 100 billion a year. So the country is getting into debt at the rate of 100 billion a year, which they're borrowing from Germany and Northern Europe. So that is the way they are enslaving Greece. It's deliberate. And of course they stand up and say, well, the Greeks are a lazy bunch, they stand around in the hot sun, don't do anything, it's all their fault. No, this was a deliberate plan to shut Greece's manufacturing. So just as the French did not pay the salaries of the German soldiers as they invaded France in the last World War, the Greeks should not repay the loans which were a Trojan horse to enslave them. So we then need to go back to the banking system that existed before 1999, before the government deregulated it. And we need to change the political class. So we need to ban from public office for life ministers, MPs, political parties and senior civil servants who colluded with the EU on the grounds of treasonous activity. And of course, most importantly of all, we must ban secret organisations from all political and government offices. So that, of course, includes Bilderbergers, Freemasons and common purpose. We obviously need to abolish VAT, which is the worst tax ever invented. It creates millions of hours of work to create a tax which isn't a very efficient tax. If you want a tax, you need 1 or 2 taxes, not the 3,000 we have on the statute book at the moment. We need to abolish all 120,000 EU regulations, and all EU-based laws and treaties as treasonous and the laws of a foreign power under our British Constitution, as Albert has already outlined. We need to close 3/4 of government bureaucracy, all 8,500 quangos, fire their staff and put them on the dole at half their current pay for 2 years. You can't put them on the dole. It wasn't their fault. That they didn't create the quangos and they didn't create the bureaucracy. So you can't put them on normal dole. It's not fair. So you save 200 billion there. EU regulations, according to the government's Better Regulation Task Force, cost this country 100 billion a year. So straight off, we are 300 billion better off. And we can afford to pay our people a decent wage immediately. We need to limit the number of government employees to 15% in the Constitution, 15% of the workforce. If you cut down the government waste, what steps into its place? Profitable businesses, good incomes, high salaries. And that needs to be done in the Constitution. The government should not be able to raise more than 25%, 20 or 25% of the entire domestic, gross domestic product. And if they do, that government needs to be dismissed. The Constitution needs some teeth. And the most important thing of all, of any constitution, there's only one nation in the world that I know who's got it, and that's the Swiss. We need a clause in the Constitution which says that MPs can vote for whatever they want to during the year. None of it has an effect until at the end of the year it comes down to the people in a mass referendum. And then the people tick yes, no in boxes to every single law passed by the government as to whether or not they can have it. And that will emasculate politicians. And that is the most important thing we can do. Make politicians powerless. Because it is politicians who do the damage.
How's that going to work when chances are the 51% are brainwashed?
Or they control the election.
And I say 51, we all know it's a lot higher than 51.
Yeah.
So
Good point, brainwashed. That, of course, is the Frankfurt School subversion technique. You brainwash your people with football, X Factor, drivel on television, celebrity get me out of here. You give them no news, you don't give them any documentaries. There wasn't one documentary on the EU treaties. And you then brainwash them, fill the vacuum with a load of rubbish. So
they'll vote for whatever they want them to vote for?
Well, yeah. Yes. But the Swiss don't. The Swiss are the most politically astute nation in the world because they know they have political power. But I spent some time working at the BBC on the inside, in Television House in Wood Lane. And they have 400 common purpose people on the inside censoring out anti-EU news. And the BBC cannot put out one single word. The BBC cannot broadcast a word without going through the Siemens transmission network. Because Siemens is a very large German company, and Germany controls the output of the BBC. So, a bit of a digression there, but yes, you're absolutely right. The British are completely brainwashed. It is a Frankfurt School subversion technique.
So referendums on that basis are screwed,
Yes, you're absolutely right. We're not going to get a referendum, so I wouldn't worry about that. But if you did...
on each little issue.
In Switzerland they have a referendum on each issue. So in Switzerland, of course, the ministers and prime minister are bribed by the European Union, as all ministers are. So each year they pass a law saying that Switzerland is going to enter the European Union. And every year the Swiss say, no you bloody won't. And that is the only reason that Switzerland is not in the EU.
They also have the right to bear arms.
Sorry?
They have the right to bear
Yes,
arms.
also have the right to bear arms. Now, of course, in Britain, they keep having these arms amnesties and huge penalties for owning weapons of any description, any kind of gun. And, of course, there isn't a reason for that. There is only one valid reason to own a gun or a weapon. What is that reason?
Social self for your children. That's when they got the guns.
No, it's to shoot politicians! Politicians know that. And that's why they don't want us having guns. The Albert II approach would be, Albert Burgess' second approach would be, if we can't do this lawfully, and we're having a go lawfully, and it's doing pretty damn well, would be, right, you shoot all 17 Bilderbergers. Immediately 17 other Bilderbergers will move up into their place. You shoot at 17, you won't get any more. The whole thing will collapse at that point. So the Swiss system, the Swiss constitution, has been absolutely brilliant, and of course they're also armed. And the other country that's armed, of course, is the USA. And there are 300 million private guns in America, and there's only about 270 million people. And that's probably the ultimate guarantee of democracy. When things get too bad, Americans will probably come out shooting. They do pay a terrible price for that, of course, and that is about 5,000 Americans a year get shot dead because it's so easy to get to one. But frankly, I think it's a price worth paying. I'd like to finish with a letter that I write every now and then to the BBC when they invite me to pay a license fee. And I suggest that you all write the same letter. And I've just set up a new website called abolishthebbc.co.uk. And it's not, the only thing that's on it at the moment is the letter, but there'll be more in time. And the letter's headed, Breach of Charter Invalidates Licence Fee. Your charter states, inter alia, the BBC is to be independent, fair, impartial, and report the news. You concealed from the public the most major news event in our 3,500-year history, the illegal abolition of Britain by the Lisbon Treaty on the 1st of January 2009, and its replacement by the EU dictatorship. You deliberately failed to broadcast any honest documentaries on the 6 EU treaties that would have warned the public abolition was approaching, your solemn bounden duty under your charter. The BBC has a 5th column, 400 common purpose people inside censoring out anti-EU news. We have their names. You have been complicit in the broadcasting of many of the EU's 200 Frankfurt School subversion techniques over the last 40 years, one of which is to brainwash with nonsensical, irrelevant or rubbish programming instead of accurate news and honest information. You are guilty of deliberately dumbing down the populace. You have also illegally received large sums from the EU, which is bribery by a foreign power, and you illegally act as the EU's agent against the British people who pay your licence fee. You also employ a wasteful bureaucracy of 27,000 people when you need 2,000, and spend 7 billion of our money when you need 800 million. You extort these graceful sums from the public with the grossly unjust licence fee, which forces people to pay for this abysmal service when they may rather watch ITV or one of the hundreds of other channels. The whole basis of the licence fee is illegal under common law. Under British statute and common law, any attempt to undermine British sovereignty is considered treason, and the BBC has been deeply complicit. The penalty for quite minor treason is either life imprisonment or to hang by the neck until dead, e.g. William Joyce, 1946, and all he did was broadcast on the radio. And hanging by the neck till dead should be the fate of all your board members since 1970. You've rubbished your charter and forfeited any rights to extort your criminal licence fee. The concealment of the paedophilia of Jimmy Savile and many others in the BBC is typically indicative representative of corruption. Accusing Lord McAlpine of paedophilia is the management's couldn't care less incompetence. The BBC is way beyond redemption, utterly corrupt, and needs to be closed permanently. Yours sincerely, David Noakes. I haven't paid a licence fee for 10 years. I don't really think they want the case coming to court. Can I please recommend on the website I have 50 reasons to leave the EU. It's about the it's about the fifth thing down on the left-hand side, I think. Any of you seen it or read it? 50 reasons to leave the EU. That's what it looks like. I've got 9 of them here. But if you go to the website and you click on it, you get the URL at the top. It ends in HTML. If you change the .html on the top to .doc, you can print it as a Word document. And if you change it to .pdf, you can print it as a PDF. But the 50 reasons to leave the EU are completely compelling. The first of them is, of course, the European Union's 6 constitutional treaties build a 3-tier Politburo dictatorship. The Soviet Union was a 1-tier unelected dictatorship. The EU is a 3-tier unelected dictatorship. So it's all on there, and every line is a really hard punch. And what I would really like you to do is to print off a load of them and just hand them out in your town. And whoever you speak to, tell them the EU is a dictatorship. Do you know we've been in it since the year 2009? Can you feel the EU police state growing up around you? And most people can. The police, all branches of government, the courts, were only created to serve and protect us, to make our lives better. Now they are all being turned into enforcement departments in the post-democratic era. That's why it is so incredibly important to stop this. And that is why I really do ask you to get out there and do something and join Albert's campaign. Thank you very much indeed.